David is, as many of us know, anybody in the gardening world around here knows who David Salman is. But if you don't know, he is a graduate of Colorado State University. He has a degree in horticultural science, but he has been a plantsman here for over 30 years and has incredible expertise in a whole wide range of endeavors. He's, what should I say, he's promoted plant development and production. He's introduced a number of new plants. He's focuses on breeding and improvement of water-wise plants. And he's a leading voice in the need for gardeners to plant habitat for pollinators and the importance of xeric, water-wise landscape design. He writes a lot, he speaks a lot, and like I say, everybody who's very much into the plant world around him here knows who David Salman is, and I'm glad that you're finally going to get to meet him. So David, I welcome you. Please enlighten us.
Well, thank you, Sally. All right, well, we're going to be talking about the principles of eco-friendly xeriscaping, and I want to welcome all of you to tonight's presentation. I think this is a nice alternative considering that we're sheltering in place, so good time to sit back and learn some basics. I've provided a handout for the presentation this evening, and that's available to be emailed to you if you already, you may already have it. So there's no need to write down what you see on the screen here because it is in the handout. And so the handout will be kind of your written primer of the principles of xeriscaping, and I think you'll find it a very useful reference in the future when you're out looking at your landscape and making decisions about what to do and how to keep it water-wise. So let's go ahead and get started. As you can see, we're going to be talking about the principles of eco-friendly xeriscaping. So, let's see here. Well, this is the old paradigm. Here in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, pretty much all across North America, the typical landscape has been a lot of lawn and perhaps some clipped juniper hedges, as you see here. But bottom line is that this type of landscape is really a biological wasteland. It really doesn't provide any flowers for pollinators. It doesn't provide any habitat for songbirds or useful reptiles and amphibians, things like that. So we want to get rid of that. But what we don't want to do is to xeriscape. I have to say that I'm not a real fan of the word xeriscaping. It's a term that was brought into the lexicon back in the early 80s by the Denver Water Board with the idea of getting their water customers in the Denver metro area to be more thrifty with their water use in their outdoor landscapes. So they came up with the word xeriscape, but unfortunately so many people mispronounce it as, I'm going to go out and xeriscape my yard. Well, as you can see, there's a xeriscape on your screen, and that's not the way to go either, because granted, you don't need a lot of water on that yard, but it creates its own problems by adding to the urban heat island problem, or the urban heat island effect. And we don't see it a lot yet in Santa Fe, but where it's really noticeable, I travel to Phoenix occasionally on business and vacations, etc. And now, because Phoenix is no longer primarily an agricultural area as it used to be 50, 60 years ago, now it's just a huge metro area with square miles of roads and concrete and homes and buildings and parking lots. And so there, the heat the urban heat island problem is getting quite extreme. If you follow the weather at all, you'll see that in the summer that Phoenix has been getting up to 117. It's almost hit 120, and that's the temperature recorded in the shade. Phoenix is getting so hot that even some of the desert plants are starting to die because the urban heat island effect, all this hardscape, the concrete and buildings holds the heat and then releases it back at night. So it's not uncommon when you go to Phoenix now that the nighttime low is 100 degrees. So plants never are able to shut down because they have to keep their metabolism going to cool themselves. So the urban heat island problem is a big reason that we don't want to xeriscape. And then the other thing, when you look at this landscape on your screen, it's a west-facing wall. And what you don't see is there's a huge air conditioning unit on the roof on the other side of the home. Now, if this homeowner, this is on my way to work to my greenhouse on Rafina Street. So I've driven by this landscape now for 36 years, and that's exactly how it still looks. But if 36 years ago, this homeowner would have planted some shade trees and put in some ground covers, they wouldn't need that massive air conditioning unit, which takes up lots of, uses up a lot of electricity. And of course, electricity uses a lot of water because the big cooling towers, they're the big electricity suppliers for New Mexico are the power plants in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona. And they use thousands of acre feet of water to generate the electricity. So xeriscaping clearly is not the solution, because even though it does save water locally, it doesn't regionally. And of course, the comfort in your home is paramount, and a well-done xeriscape provides shade and comfort. So this is not what we want to do. Instead, we want a well-designed xeric planting. So this is a beautiful small planting of tough perennials blooming in midsummer. And this planting only requires, say, a good watering once a week. So to dispel the notion that xeriscaping is ugly, that xeriscaping is really zero-scaping, is just not true. And I hope one of the main things that you'll come away from tonight's presentation is that xeriscaping and xeric plantings can be every bit as beautiful as the more traditional water-intensive plantings. So what I want to do is acquaint you with the 8 basic principles of eco-friendly xeriscaping. So as we look at the list, we have plan and design, which is very important. This is something that you need to give a lot of thought to, either when you're refurbishing an existing landscape or starting from scratch with a new xeriscape design. We'll go into the details about that. Number 2 is planting practical turf areas or alternatives. Not that Santa Fe has an overabundance of lawns anymore. We've just gotten out of a 10-year drought in 2019. It was a 100-year plus intensity drought, and there aren't really that many lawns. If there were many in Santa Fe, they're not now. So we'll look at ways to cover large areas of your yard without having to use water-intensive turf. Then number 3, you'll notice I highlighted 3 of the 8 concepts in green, and I refer to this as kind of the 3-legged stool of xeriscaping. These are the 3 most important parts, and then the other 5 principles support the 3 basic principles. So number 3 is use the diversity of regionally suitable plants. Number 4, improve and maintain the soil organically, as well as gardening organically. We don't want to be using a lot of chemical pesticides, particularly many of you have probably heard about the neonicotinoids, these systemic insecticides that are basically killing the planet. We'll talk about that in a minute. Number 5, the use of mulches to conserve water and keep water in the soil, keep the soil cooler for better plant growth. Number 6 is to irrigate efficiently, because to have a have a nice landscape here in Santa Fe, you do need to do some supplemental irrigation. It's possible to have a landscape without irrigation, but it's going to be a little sparse. Number 7, water harvesting, and that means capturing snow and rain runoff and applying it to keeping it on your yard and applying it to your plants. And then finally, number 8 is practicing appropriate maintenance. So let's just jump into these 8 principles and get more details on each of them. So principle number 1 is plan and design. So just kind of stepping back before we do anything, let's just highlight what's really important in terms of what our xeriscapes can provide. They can provide habitat for songbirds, pollinators, and beneficial insects. So we want to be sure that we use plants that provide shelter, food, and nectar. And we want to have a water source available, either a bird bath or fountains or something like that. But water is very, very important in terms of habitat creation. Now, our xeriscapes can be multi-purpose. We can plant food for songbirds, but let's not forget ourselves. So planting fruit trees, fruiting shrubs, culinary herbs, and other plants are useful both to us as well as other creatures. Most of these plants have both ornamental and culinary value. We want to be sure and plant lots of native trees and shrubs to provide caterpillars for songbirds to raise their chicks. Very interesting research has revealed that non-native plants, what I call old world plants, are unable to be fed on by native insects because of the phytochemistry in their foliage. The native insects don't have the physiology that allows them to eat like a Bradford pear leaf and digest the chemicals. So we want to, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, planting as many natives as possible to support habitat and to support a healthy regional ecology. So the photo on your screen here is a beautiful apricot tree over on 2nd Street. And apricots are wonderful xeric trees. Not that we get a lot of apricots from them, but gosh, last year we had a bumper crop and half of apricots. So the point being that there are many trees and shrubs that provide both beauty and food for ourselves and other creatures. Another thing that we want to look at, and I talked about this in the xeriscape slide, is planting deciduous trees to provide shade. And you can see that shading buildings will reduce the need for air conditioning and let the winter sun shine through to warm the house or building and reduce heating demand. So this is a office building over on Hospital Drive, and these are 2 cottonwood trees planted on the south side of the building. And you can see this is fall, they're starting to color up, but they provide wonderful shade, what otherwise would just be a scorchingly hot south-facing wall, and of course require that the building use a lot of energy-intensive air conditioning to keep the building comfortable. Well, by thinking ahead and planning to plant shade trees in the appropriate spots, we can reduce energy consumption and improve the comfort of our homes and commercial buildings. Another thing to plan for is, I'm sure all of you are feeling pretty much like you've got a cabin fever after this long winter that we've had, and that's typical of northern New Mexico. Things go into dormancy in late October and are still asleep, waiting for spring to arrive. Here it is almost April. So to keep our landscapes, our xeriscapes interesting, we need to remember to plant for all 4 seasons. Plant for, it's easy to plant for spring flowers and summer flowers, but we want to remember to plant for the fall and winter with colorful plants that provide fall foliage and plants that provide winter interest. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a very cold hardy succulent, agave perii, or a century plant. And it's basically a living sculpture. And in the winter, it really comes into its own, as you can see here, under a blanket of snow. Gives it a very interesting look. And on the right side of the screen, this is a beautiful native shrub known as the Growlow sumac. And the photo was taken in October, and the green summer foliage is now turned to a blazing burgundy red. So fall color and winter interest are very important components to an interesting landscape that provides you with enjoyment and beauty year-round. Now, one misconception among many regarding xeriscaping is that not all plants in a xeriscape are xeric. So this may sound like a little bit of a contradiction, but not at all. Let's just understand what we're talking about. There are many plants that like to grow in shade and in moister ground. And our buildings here in New Mexico, because of the strength of our sunshine and the numerous days of blue sky, create a situation where we have microclimates surrounding our buildings. So what this slide illustrates is that this moisture-loving birch tree normally would not be a great choice for a xeriscape if you put it out on the south or west side, the hot, dry side of the home. But instead, this birch was planted on the north side of the house where the soil is moister and cooler, and it also has a couple of canales that drain from the roof onto the soil on the north side. So of a plant that likes more moisture, but has a place in the xeriscape because it can be situated with a moisture microclimate. And there are plants that we can use in the xeriscape that can be used on the north and northeast sides of buildings, like columbines and vinca, which is a nice evergreen ground cover. They're shade-loving shrubs. So there are a lot of plants that we can use in the xeriscape in the moisture microclimates around our buildings and still qualify the planting as a xeriscape. So not everything that we want to plant in a water-wise planting needs to be a desert dweller. That's just not the case. So next thing to look at is, let's be sure that we make plants the most important aspect of your landscape design. So many buildings and homes around Santa Fe, you'll note, particularly new construction, is they run out of money by the time they put in the, build the house and then put in the sidewalks and walls surrounding the portal. So the houses have lots of hardscaping, but no plants. So this photo here shows what just a small number of plants put into what otherwise is a pretty stark looking hardscape really makes a difference. So when we're using rock and other hardscape elements, put in the plants to add color, texture, motion, and soften the look. This is also a really good example. On the right-hand side of the photograph is a driveway that drains water into that little dry stream bed you see there, the little gravel meandering stream bed there. That's what we call a dry stream bed. So that little dry stream bed actually fills with water that runs off of the driveway when they get a good rain, and provides water not only to the ornamental grasses growing there, but of course the trees on the other side of the wall have their roots under the wall and also are able to soak up water from the little dry stream bed when water is available running off the driveway. So the point of this image here is to emphasize, make plants the focus of your xeriscape, not the hardscape, because of course too much hardscape is an urban heat island problem. Planting trees is a really important thing in terms of helping the planet and providing comfort and beauty in our xeriscapes. Because planting trees, they provide shade, screening, and out in Aldea, wind protection is important. That area can get quite a bit of wind coming out of the northwest and southwest. So trees can provide some wind protection as well. But when we're planting trees, we need to realize that these are a long-term addition to our xeriscapes, and we want to be sure that they fit as they get larger. We want to match their mature size to the appropriate location. One of the things that I joke about is what I call the blue spruce syndrome. Is you go out to the nursery and you see this beautiful little 5-gallon blue spruce and you think, oh, perfect, really nice next to my front door. But what people forget, of course, is that the blue spruce can eventually grow up to a 60-foot with a 30-foot width. So clearly, if we planted it next to our front door in about 15 years, we'd be kicking ourselves thinking, what in the world were we doing when we put this tree in? It looked great in the original container, but it just is not the right size at maturity. So you want to match the mature size of the tree to its planting spot, and be sure and read the tag so you get an idea of what the mature size is. And another important thing, and I've seen this done over and over, is never plant under or over a power line. I remember many, many years ago when Rio Rancho was just starting to be developed, they put in the, I think it was called the Riverview subdivision, and there was a power line parallel to the highway, and they put in 2 miles of cottonwoods right under the power line. Well, of course, a few years later, they had to cut down all the cottonwoods because they were growing right up into the power line. So before you plant, look up is a good rule of thumb. And then I like to recommend a mixture of deciduous and evergreen species, because evergreens, again, referring back to the earlier slide when we talk about planting for 4 seasons of interest, evergreens make such a big difference here in the winter. When the rest of the landscape has dropped its leaves and is asleep, it's the evergreens that really come into the forefront of our landscape. And to address that blue spruce syndrome, there's lots of dwarf blue spruce that might only get to 10 feet. So we don't want to rule out using blue spruce in our xeriscape, for example, but rather choose a dwarf or a semi-dwarf type of conifer for our smaller yards so that we don't regret planting these evergreens down the line. Now, when we're planting trees, what we've really learned over the years, I've been gardening here in Santa Fe for nearly 40 years. And when I got started in the start of the 1980s, it turns out that the 1980s were the wettest decade in New Mexico, and they estimate the last 1,000 years. And then between 2010 and 2019 was the driest, one of the driest periods in New Mexico in at least the past several hundred years. So trees that we were able to plant out in just kind of what I call the South 40 of the yard, away from the house, just out in the flats of the yard, we used to get enough rainfall and snowfall that trees with some supplemental irrigation would have enough water to grow suitably. But the drought really has taught us that our climate here in New Mexico is getting drier and drier. So when we plant trees, we need to supplement their water needs with harvested water, either from the roof or gray water. You know, if you drain your tub or sinks, take that water out and apply them into the yard where your trees can utilize them. So you can see, here's a canale after a rain. It's cleared up, but the roof is still draining, and the canale drains into a dry stream bed. But actually, what's under there is called a pumice wick, which is another topic. We'll refer to that a little later. So planting near a roof downspout is very desirable because larger trees need a lot of water. Now, we don't want to snug a big tree right up next to the house, but it's very easy to move water from the roof to the tree's root system by using a dry stream bed, or we can use a collecting receptacle with a a buried pipe out to where you're going to plant it. So we want to be sure and plant our trees now where we can get supplemental harvested water or gray water to them. And when we plant cottonwoods and other moisture-loving trees, the building code now requires that we hold water on our lots for at least 24 or 48 hours so that we don't have a lot of water coming off hard surfaces down into our storm sewers. So where the building code requires a depression to hold the water, that's a great place to plant cottonwoods and other moisture-loving trees, not out in the flat, dry parts of the yard. So water harvesting and trees it's important that we combine the two. Now, a good way to be sure that you stay within your water budget, Santa Fe allows increased outdoor watering from May to September. I think we can go up to 14,000 gallons without incurring a penalty. When you use, I think it's between 14,000 and 20,000 gallons, the water per gallon costs you more, and then it's a tiered system. So the more you use, the more expensive the water gets. So one of the principles of xeriscaping that we can utilize to try and keep our outdoor water use to 14,000 gallons a month or less. Now that includes, that 14,000 gallons includes both interior use, washing machines, dishwashers, bathing, as well as landscape use. So what we do is use the principle of water zoning. So when we set up our drip system, we want to be sure that we have different zones so that we can run one zone less and another zone more. And so when we lay out our plantings, we want to use our most water-intensive plantings, roses or vegetable garden, things like that, in zone 1, which is what we call the oasis zone. And in the oasis zone, established plants will need irrigation maybe 1 to 2 times a week. And then as we move out away from the house to zone 2, which is what we call the transition zone, and that's where we use more of our xeric plants that, when established, might need a good irrigation every 1 to 2 weeks. And then we move out to zone 3, which is the xeric zone, which is, along the fence in your backyard, or maybe a side yard, or up front if you have a very deep front yard. Places well away from the house, these are the xeric zones where we want to put our extra xeric plants that, once established, might only need irrigation 1 to 2 times a month, if that. A lot of native shrubs, for example, once established, need very little supplemental irrigation. So by planning your plantings to use the most water-intensive plants up close to the house and the least water-intensive plants furthest from the house, you can use the water wisely and where it really counts. When you live back east and they get 40 or 50 inches of rain a year, basically the whole yard is one zone because you get plenty of water, so you can cover your entire lot with a bluegrass lawn. But that's just completely impractical here in New Mexico. And so that's why we want to use this principle known as water use zones. Okay, moving on. So to make frugal use of our outdoor irrigation water, rather than intensively landscape your entire yard, what you can do is find views out from your house. Maybe it's outside your kitchen window, around your front or back portal, and use dramatic plant combinations to create focal points. And so these are a couple of examples on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a beautiful planting coming up to a front door in Rancho Viejo, and these are all really xeric plants. Or on the left side of the screen, one of my favorites, that's an agave havardiana, the big century plant at the lower part of the photo, and beautiful ornamental grasses behind them, which provide a contrast and texture and movement. Agaves don't move at all, no matter how strong the wind, whereas the grasses, even in a gentle breeze, provide a graceful movement. So by providing showy plantings and focal points is a good way to limit your water use. So principle number 2, planting practical turf areas or alternatives. Well, out in the Aldea area, I think the reality is that a big bluegrass lawn is just completely impractical. You would use thousands and thousands of gallons of water. And my big question is why? There are alternatives, and here's a good one shown on the screen. This is a commercial office space off of St. Mike's. And instead of using a water-intensive grass like so many commercial plantings do, they used our native blue grama grass. So this native grass provides a nice, soft green color. It only needs about 4 to 6 inches of supplemental water during the growing season. So they may only need to water this blue grama maybe a couple of times a month as opposed to 2 to 3 times a week for blue grama. So using our native turf grass alternatives is a very good way to go, and still providing the green ground cover that more water intensive grasses typically need. We can also, in the case of some homeowners have kids that they want a play area for them. So you can use what we refer to as water-wise fescue grasses. My former company, High Country Gardens, we formulated a grass mix called the Low Work and Water. It's a dwarf fescue grass seed mix that uses about 30 to 40% less water than the Kentucky bluegrass, which is often used in a lot of parks and playing fields. So you can have a softer grass for a kid's play area using the right lower water grasses. But the most important thing if you're going to have a lawn is to care for the lawn organically, using organic fertilizers and whatnot, and don't use weed and feeds. Those are awful. They have systemic pre-emergent herbicides, which can damage plants whose roots grow under the lawn. So lawns, you need to be judicious in their use. And really for Aldea, this is more applicable, is to try planting a prairie, dominated by bluegrass, and then you mix in a lot of wildflowers. So by planting a prairie, you're providing an ecologically diverse assortment of plants that support beneficial insects, pollinators, songbirds, horned toads, and other reptiles. And we don't have a lot of amphibians here, frogs and salamanders, but a lot of lizards and whatnot are very good at eating insects too, so they can make use of this as well. These prairies are low maintenance and xeric once established and provide excellent habitat. This is a beautiful prairie garden up at the Denver Botanic Gardens in Denver, Colorado. And now all of these plants in the photo here are native to New Mexico. So there's absolutely no reason that out in Aldea you couldn't have a similar front or a backyard planting instead of grass, which is not very habitat friendly. Or particularly in shade, you can, use ground covers. Now this is an excellent example on the north side of the house, for example. It's a shadier area and a little bit moisture. You can use, this is a ground cover called Lamium, and the variety is White Nancy. It has a beautiful variegated foliage and white flowers. So there are a lot of excellent ground covers that we can use in place of lawns, particularly in very hot, dry areas or in shady, cool areas where grass doesn't like to grow. Now, principle number 3, using regionally suitable plants. This is the most important thing that new gardeners need to understand when gardening in New Mexico, which might be very unfamiliar for, in terms of what one is used to, particularly if you move from the Midwest or California or the East Coast. Trying to recreate an East Coast garden with red buds and azaleas and rhododendrons and whatnot is folly. The plants will just never do well here. And so to have a beautiful low-care xeriscape, you want to plant plants various trees, perennials, cactus and succulents, ornamental grasses that are adapted to our poor soils, our dry climate, our summer heat, our winter cold, our winds, our alkaline water. And when you look at those lists of planting conditions you want to match, you go, oh my goodness, is there anything that grows? Yes, actually, we can grow more different types of plants here in New Mexico than gardeners in the Midwest or the East Coast or even parts of California. So there are a lot of plants, both native and old world, that are well adapted to high cold desert regions. So in terms of regionally suitable plants, we can use native perennials, as you see on the left side of your screen. That's a little Hymenopsis and a spineless cactus. And on the left side of the screen, on the right side of the screen, these are old world perennials, catmint and white Jupiter's beard. And old world plants refer to plants that come to us from Europe, Asia, South Africa. For example, apples, apricots, those are from Western Asia, gladiolas and agapanthus, and a number of our bulbs come from South Africa. So there is a place for a lot of old world plants that are a good match with our growing conditions here in northern New Mexico. And in terms of using regionally suitable plants, we want to plant for diversity, plant a wide range of plant types and varieties. We want to use as many native plants as possible, because native plants are an essential cornerstone of our regional ecosystems. And native plants feed native insects upon which birds and other small mammals depend. So native plants are the basis for the food chain wherever you live. And so what I recommend is a ratio of about 70 to 80% native plants to about 20 to 30% old world plants. Now, why do we want to use old world plants? Well, many of them do very well here, like lilacs and fruit trees like apricots, apples, peaches, pears. Those are all old world plants. So old world plants have a prominent part in terms of our food production and our ornamental plants. We just want to balance the use of old world plants by using less of them and more of our native species. Now, this is principle number 4 is something that is an issue out in Aldea and any other subdivision. And that is that the construction methods, when a subdivision is developed, destroys the soil and presents you homeowners with a big problem, because as you can see here, this is a subdivision outside of Rio Rancho, outside of Albuquerque. And you can see now the lots are ready to be built on, but they're highly compacted. In fact, it's probably a question mark, what's harder, the asphalt road in front or the soil behind? Because these have been compacted to provide for a hard ground for foundations. So this compaction has killed the soil's microbial population, and there's no organic matter, because many times what topsoil there was gets scraped off and hauled away, often sold, leaving behind the subsoil. So these soils need to be repaired if your xeriscape is going to have any chance of success. So what I recommend for bringing the life back to your soil are this list of key soil amendments. A good quality compost. Soil Mender is a common brand here in northern New Mexico. It's composted in the panhandle of Texas. Yum Yum Mix organic fertilizer is a fabulous soil food that was actually formulated by a local Santa Fe landscaper and provides an excellent organically derived, naturally derived ingredients to feed your soil, which then feeds the plants. And then it's also extremely important that you use a mycorrhizal root inoculant. And mycorrhizal refers to a type of fungus that attach themselves to plant roots, particularly xeric native plants, grow in association with these mycorrhizal fungi. And the fungi helps the plant's root system improve water and nutrient uptake. And the first thing to be killed off when developers scrape off the soil to create the lots and compact the soil is that this kills the mycorrhizal fungal population underneath the soil that the plants depend on. So when you replant into the soil after mixing the yum yum mix and a good quality compost into the soil to break it up, aerate it, after you plant, you want to use these mycorrhizal root inoculants to reintroduce these beneficial fungi. Now, we want to go lightly with soil improvement for natives and more heavily for vegetables and moisture-loving plants like roses and things like that. So you use all three, whether it's for xeric plants or old world, more water-intensive plants like roses and delphiniums and Shasta daisies and things like that. So it's very important that you add these ingredients to bring the life back to your soil. Now, the other thing that's important in terms of the soil is the use of mulches. Mulching helps to protect the soil from the drying rays of the sun, and our sun here is, I'm sure you all are aware of now, is very intense, has a very high UV component, 50% more UV light even than Denver at Mile High north of us. So mulch helps to protect the soil, keep it moist, keep it cool, and provides a better root growing environment for the plants that are growing in the soil. This is out in Rancho Viejo. Left side of the screen shows unplanted gravel mulch, which is a shame because gravel mulch is a really good mulch to plant into because it can be used for water harvesting. When a hard rain falls on gravel mulch, instead of hitting bare soil and running off, the gravel decreases the velocity of the water and allows the water to soak into the soil. So what you want to do when you have gravel mulch is on the right side of the screen. This is in the winter, but these are all different types of native shrubs as well as honey locust trees, which benefit greatly from being planted in gravel mulch. Other mulches that you can use to cool your soil include living ground covers like ground cover junipers. Many perennial ground covers are excellent living mulches. You can use pine needles. You can go out to the dump and get the ground up wood and leaves. That makes an excellent mulch, particularly under trees and shrubs. You can use crushed pecan shells. You can use coarse textured compost. So there are a lot of different types of mulch materials, but the key thing is mulching is so important to planting success here in northern New Mexico. Now here's an example of using cold hardy ice plants on top of gravel mulch. And what a perfect combination. It's like peanut butter and jelly. These Adelosperma, these cold hardy ice plants, love growing on top of gravel mulch. Helps keep their foliage dry during wet winters, but yet keeps the soil cooler and moister during the growing season. So you can have gravel mulch and then plant these heat-loving ground covers on top to grow on top of the gravel mulch to give you beauty and to cool down the reflected glare and heat that the gravel mulch would create. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's important that you irrigate your gardens for them to look their best. But of course, if you use these xeric principles, you'll use a lot less water than the traditional style of landscape and plant choices. So we have basically 4 ways of irrigating our yards: drip irrigation, soaker hoses, sprinklers, and hand watering. All work well. Drip irrigation is very efficient, but you can also use a tremendous amount of water and not know it because you don't see the water being thrown into the air like you would for a sprinkler. Soaker hoses I like very much to irrigate, like for example, pinon. To keep pinon healthy, put a soaker hose around the drip line of the tree and then just give the pinon a good monthly soaking to keep it healthy, keep pests at bay, and to allow them to grow more robustly. Because the Aldea area is a very dry area out there, and your soils are, that's a generous term, I would say, for the soil out there. It's pretty bad, very alkaline, a lot of caliche. So soaker hoses are a really good way to keep even xeric conifers like pinon adequately watered without using a lot of water. You can use sprinklers and hand watering. Now, when you're using drip irrigation, it's best to water less frequently, but more deeply. So, for example, I like to water once a week for an hour per zone so that the water goes down at least 6 to 8 inches down into the root zone. Unfortunately, a lot of drip system equipment comes with these asinine use instructions that tell people to water, I think, 3 times a day for 10 minutes, which might work all right for coastal California, but it's a complete waste of water and is not nearly enough water to keep the plants alive. You have to remember, roots follow the water down into the soil. So if you water frequently but lightly, the roots are right up top in the hottest, driest part of the soil profile. Whereas if you water deeply, less frequently, the water goes deep and the roots go down deep. So that's the mantra for irrigation is water less frequently and deeply, and forget the frequent short duration irrigation schedule. Does no good. Now, a very important thing that we talked about earlier when we saw the three-legged stool of xeriscaping, water harvesting. I suspect that in the next 10 to 15 years that Santa Fe residents will not be allowed to use potable water for outdoor irrigation. Just look around us. I think they're building 2,000 apartment units right now. Santa Fe is not getting any more water. Our climate's getting drier, so we keep slicing the water pie thinner and thinner. So to have a decent looking landscape, to have shade trees, we need to harvest water from the roofs of our homes, off of our driveways and other hard surfaces. Any hard surface that sheds water, we should be directing that water onto our landscapes. So there's a couple of ways to harvest water. We can use active systems, which involves pumping water from storage tanks out into the xeriscape through some type of irrigation system. And these can be rather complicated and can be very expensive. Whereas another way is called passive systems, using gravity to move water into the storage and gravity to move water out into the soil. So the example on the photo on this slide shows a downspout coming off of the roof feeding into a water barrel. Well, when I look at that water barrel, why don't they just put a little pipe under the sidewalk in a dry stream bed and then direct that water right out to those aspen trees, which are not a good choice. Aspens are a short-lived tree at best, and if you're going to use them, you only want to use them on the north or northeast side of the house. This is on the west side of this building. But my point is that gravity never fails. So you can count on water to bring the gravity to bring water from the roof down to the soil level, and rather than make it a two-step process with a water barrel, which a lot of people never get around to using, just direct the water right to the base of the trees. And that's going to be the method of irrigating a lot of our trees in the future when we're not allowed to irrigate outdoors. Now, that's a few years off, but it's coming. And when you plant a tree, that's a long-term investment. A healthy tree should be out in your yard for 30 to 100 years. So if you're going to have big mature trees, you've got to harvest water to support them. And then finally, principle number 8 is practice appropriate maintenance. And one of the things that really just boils my kettle is shearing, particularly these beautiful native shrubs, because it destroys the landscape with lousy pruning and just creates a long-term landscape maintenance project. So you can see on the left side of your screen, that's a beautiful evergreen Xeriscaping ledifolius, the curl leaf mountain mahogany. And on the right side of the screen, that little ugly square rectangle on the right side of the photo is a Xeriscaping ledifolius that's been butchered into a rectangle. There's absolutely no reason to do that. There's plenty of room for the shrub to grow up and out. Same thing with that poor juniper that's been whacked into an unusable plant, an unrecognizable plant. So that's completely unnecessary, and it's just make work. So don't destroy your beautiful shrubs by shearing. Other things to consider when we're maintaining our xeriscapes is to fertilize in the fall. That's the best time. If you didn't get a chance to fertilize in the fall, right now is a good time to spread a compost and the yum yum. I like to mix the two in a wheelbarrow and then just throw out handfuls on top of the soil and scratch it in, because the principle of organic gardening in terms of soil fertilization is we feed the soil to feed our plants. So in other words, a healthy living soil is full of microbes and earthworms which take the yum yum mix and compost, digest it for their own nutritional needs, and then break it down and leave it for the plants to uptake when they need it. Another thing, now aldeas, I'm sure you have gophers out there. It's probably not as bad as it is here in town, but you want to control gophers with an emulsified castor oil repellent to protect the roots of your plants, or they'll make short work of your plantings. So be looking now, because gophers are active. And we want to apply mulch to flower beds and around trees and shrubs to bring it to the correct depth in either late spring and again in mid-fall if the mulch is decomposed and gotten thin. Fall is a great time to replenish it. So generally, flower beds, we want to use mulch depth of about an inch, whether it's gravel or pine needles or coarse textured compost. And then under trees and shrubs, I like to use the ground up wood and leaves that you can get free from the city. That makes an excellent mulch for those types of plants. Now we want to leave our perennial plants and ornamental grasses standing over the winter, because this improves their cold hardiness. And it also provides shelter for beneficial insects. They lay their eggs on dead leaves and stems and to provide winter protection. And then they're hatching now, like praying mantis and lace wings that eat aphids, things like that. They overwinter in the dead foliage on our ornamental grasses and perennials. So we want to let them stand over the winter. One of the great beauties of ornamental grasses is their winter aspect. So to cut the ornamental grasses down in the fall, you're depriving yourself of a whole season of beauty from the ornamental grasses that they provide in the winter. And then finally, out in Aldea, when you do get snow, by leaving your perennials and ornamental grasses standing, these plants will capture blowing snow, and then the snow will melt and go into the soil in your landscape and not just blow off onto the streets and whatnot. So you don't have to be in a big hurry in the fall to chop everything back. Let it stand. Take some time to sit on your portal and drink some iced tea or a beer in the fall, and don't worry about getting everything whacked back to the nubs for winter, because our gardens can provide us with a lot of winter interest. So I hope that you've gotten a better understanding about the principles of xeriscaping, and that you have a better appreciation that xeriscaping is beautiful and that it's not difficult. You don't have to be a professional landscaper to do it. And this is just a fine example of a very easy to grow, low maintenance, high color planting, salvia, Furman's red, and Russian sage. Both bloom much of the summer and provide nectar for pollinators. The salvia, the Furman's red, is visited by bees and hummingbirds. The Russian sage is an essential nectar source for native and honeybees. So xeriscaping is a very good way and beautiful way to beautify our properties. And then finally, I just want to encourage you all to just stop from time to time and look around and enjoy the beauty around us. This is, whoops, sorry. Believe it or not, snow bows actually exist. One January morning, I got up, and you can see the sun is just hitting Tanaha Peak there, which overlooks La Bajada Pass. And sure enough, there was a very fine mist of snow, and there was a snow bow. So it just really drove home the point that we all need to take time, take some deep breaths, look around us, and enjoy the beautiful part of the world in which we live. So that concludes my xeriscape primer this evening, and I'm going to turn off the screen and we're going to open the forum to questions that I can answer.